when the train come tearing and a roaring through the station, with its whistle blowing and it haunted steam up. It runs through the tunnels, it howls across bridges, it bursts into valleys, streaks over hills, and disappears back into the shadows as the morning approaches. The engine shivered. "Come on now, Tavish," Alan said, the only one laughing. "There's no such thing as ghosts." There is too, Herbert said, quivering. "Bah," Nigel said, closing his eyes. "Those are just children's stories, to scare young engines." "They are not just stories," Tavish said. "I know what I'm on about. There are lots of ghost engines. I'll tell you a story about the scariest one of all," he said, and the other engines looked at him nervously. "The name of this particular story is The Curse of Fowler's Ghost." He paused impressively. Alan sniggered loudly. Tavish gave him a look of deepest loathing and shut up. "Fowler's ghost?" Herbert asked, quivering. "Herbert, isn't it about this time of year that your smoke box goes in for ash removal?" Alan inquired. "You could ask them to put your brains back at the same time." "Alan, that's enough." Stephen, the Holden B12, backed onto his road in the shed, looking exhausted. "Leave Herbert alone," he said, closing his eyes. "It's too late in the evening to start arguing." Sir Stephen?" Herbert said, and everyone knew a question was on its way. Stephen opened his eyes and smiled. "Yes, Herbert." What was Fowler's ghost?" Herbert asked. "Well," Stephen said, "it's quite a short story, really. I'm not sure if it's worth telling." "Look," Tavish grunted, "you might as well. You might get a reaction out of them, at least more than the steam-powered hyena over there." Alan scowled. Stephen sighed. "Very well," he said. So, our story begins in London, in 1861, well over 80 years ago. Sir John Fowler was a great engineer in many ways, and indeed, those of you young engines who have crossed the famous Forth Bridge will know of his work. But his greatest folly was a locomotive he built for the Metropolitan Railway. It was designed to work in the tunnels, and not to produce smoke. You all know of the cough my driver gets when we run through tunnels, and that is a rare occurrence these days. Well, these locomotives had to spend most of their lives working down tunnels, and Fowler ordered a new locomotive built to his unique design. Unfortunately, the engine didn't steam well, and on its first test run it failed miserably, just outside Hanwell Station on the Great Western Line. It made a second test run later that year, but it did not live up to expectations. Fowler was angry. The engine had failed him. He ordered it to be sheeted up and left where no one could find it. Fowler ordered the tests to be covered up and publicly denied that the engine had ever existed. Before it was hidden, Fowler had some of its parts sold for scrap, mainly boiler fittings, and once he had recouped some of his loss, he banished it to a disused tunnel on the underground system. Down in its tunnel, the engine was angry. It was not his fault that he had failed. It was the work of his designer, and he plotted his revenge. A few years later, some workmen were down in the tunnels, removing the rails to the engine's tunnel. They bricked up the line, not knowing what lay inside. As they turned to leave, an almighty crash was heard, and they turned to see the bricked-up tunnel disappear in dust and rocks. The shaft to the tunnel had collapsed, and the engine was lost beneath a ton of rubble. They sealed the shaft off, and for a while, nothing happened. Then one night, an alarm went out on the underground system. A runaway engine had been seen, thundering down the tunnel towards Edgware Road. Men went out to the tunnels and lifted some rails to derail the engine. It never came. This happened night after night for a few weeks, until men started muttering about the ghostly spectre being one of John Fowler's designs. Try as he might, he couldn't keep it secret any longer, and some photographs of the engine were released to the public. The sightings of the ghost train stopped for a while, and it was only with Fowler's death that the spectre of the engine seemed forgot. But on the 50th anniversary of the engine's failed run to Hanwell, it was seen again, and on every anniversary since. Fowler's ghost haunts the underground tunnels to this day, but it does more than that, Stephen finished. It haunts the valleys, it haunts the stations, it haunts the goods yards and the sidings. It shrieks across bridges and thunders through the cuttings. It comes to take old engines away, to sheet them up and remove them forever from this world. Alan jumped back in fright. Don't be scared, Sir Al scoffed, backing down next to Alan. I trust Stephen has finished his tale. Alan couldn't say a word. Herbert and Nigel were so pleased at Alan's fright, they went straight to sleep, smiling. Alan, on the other hand, kept his eyes open for a little longer, only closing them when he was sure no ghost, Fowler's or not, was about. Stephen had an early morning shift, and carefully puffed out of the shed towards the junction. He was the only engine around, and his crew left him, simmering, on the siding closest to the signal gantry, while they went to get some cocoa in the manager's office. The low mists were coming in, and the sky was still dark from the night. There was a whistle, shrill and echoing. Ah, Stephen said, smiling. You're here. The ghostly spectre stopped next to Stephen, silent and white. Yes, I remember you, Stephen said softly. I saw you when they pulled me from the post train's wreckage. I seem to recall you were impatient then too. The engine hissed. Oh, don't you worry, Stephen chuckled. I'm sure we'll meet again. I've seen the future in young Gronk, and steam can't last forever. The ghost engine went silent once more, agreeing with him. Did you ever find him? Stephen asked. Ah, I see, he said, as it stayed silent. That's why you're here now. He's been dead a while, you know. I would have thought he'd have gone on. The engine hissed. You can argue all you like, Stephen said, but you made the choice to stay here. At least, he said, smiling kindly once more, you've accomplished something. The engine hissed again. Well, he did his best to remove you from history, and yet, here you are. A tale told to young engines to scare them into behaving, Stephen said, and he heard what he thought was a ghostly laugh from the spectre. So, have you come for me today? He said bravely. Or is this a warning? He finished mid-sentence as the engine whistled and started to move away. When you come next time, I'll come quietly, Stephen called to the ghostly spectre. When you call me, I shall follow you onward. Little did he know, as he watched the engine vanish into the misted air and the sun rise, that it would be the last time he'd see that children's story, that pale imitation of steam that rode the rails still. Little did he know that would be the last time that he'd meet Fowler's ghost.